Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from JessCrafts.com, and today I am here with the Simon Says Stamp card kit of the month for June 2017. I think it's called Blissful, and this card kit is already sold out. I think that some of the pieces of it are available in individually, so I'll link to that, but this video serves mostly as inspiration for those who already have the kit. Although at the end I will be sharing that I'm going to be selling off a portion of the kit, so if you are really interested in the stamp set, you'll want to pay attention towards the end there with that. So you get the stamp set, you get a Simon Says Stamp Barely Beige ink, a Distress Oxide and Worn Lipstick, 4 colors of Daniel Smith watercolors, just a little bit of each to sample it. These Echo Park 6x6 papers from the Wedding Bliss collection, and you do get 12 pieces of double-sided paper, which helps you to make a lot of cards with this kit. It is obviously very wedding themed overall. They give you some ideas, and I'm going to try to give you some different ideas than the ones that they have shared with you. But there's also a bunch of cardstock, and it includes a large piece of the Ranger watercolor cardstock. I like the Ranger watercolor cardstock because it's bright white. However, it doesn't take a lot of water. It pills more easily, and so that is something to consider. To get started, something that I've kind of started doing with card kits is when I get them, I stamp the stamp set onto a large piece of cardstock so that I have a bunch of images ready to go into color. With this kit, since it included the Barely Beige ink from Simon Says Stamp, which is Copic safe and watercolor safe or waterproof, I thought, well, I could do some no-line coloring and that would look really pretty and a little bit different. And this beige color is perfect for that. So here it actually doesn't really look like I'm stamping much of anything, even though I'm like continuously stamping with my Misty here. And on the one where you see that I'm like stamping about 8 times with my Misty, it's because it's the watercolor cardstock and it has a rough texture on one side, and that was the side that I was using, so it doesn't stamp very well the first time. That's one of the nice things about a stamp positioning tool. And the other nice thing, what I'm really taking advantage of here with this stamp positioner, the Misty, is that I can stamp several sheets. So I stamped 2 pieces of like thick white cardstock that's Copic friendly, and I am then stamping half a sheet of the Ranger cardstock as well. So I don't have to reposition the stamps. I can just take out the cardstock, put in the watercolor cardstock or another piece of cardstock, and get a whole bunch of impressions with one stamping session. And then I'll have those, so when I think, oh, I really could use a flower with this card, I don't have to stop, find a piece of cardstock, stamp an individual flower. So I have those ready to go for the future. But the other thing I wanted to do was kind of play around with the Distress Oxide ink here in Worn Lipstick, and I wanted to, again, just create a couple of things to work with later. So I'm going to create a couple of backgrounds with the Distress Oxide ink and then use them later on in the video. For these backgrounds, I am using Bristol Smooth cardstock from Strathmore. I like the way that Distress inks blend on them. However, it is off-white, so I really only use it when I'm going to cover the whole piece, or if I want to leave a white spot. I don't tend to use it because it's such a different white than my card bases, but of course that's optional. So I've covered the whole thing in the pink Worn Lipstick Distress Oxide, and now I am spritzing it. One of the nice things about the Tim Holtz Distress Sprayer is that you can get really fine mist or those big water droplets. However, if you don't have the Tim Holtz sprayer, to get the big water droplets, what you can do is spray some water into your hand and sort of shake it on. Christina Warner's done that for like ever until the Distress Sprayer came out, so there's no need for the tool. It's just if you use it a lot, it might be helpful to have. However, what I found with the Distress Oxide inks is the area where the big globs of water became almost white, and I didn't really like that. I kind of wanted them to be a little bit more faded because I didn't want these big bright white spots. So in the big areas, I covered the whole piece of cardstock again with the Distress Oxide ink, and then I did a much finer mist spray the second time rather than letting it have those big drops. But it kind of depends on the look you're going for. So again, I have a bunch of backgrounds off to the side ready to go. So I'm kind of just like prepping my kit right now. And this is also part of the prepping process. I want to cut a bunch of A2 size card bases. This might not be for everyone. A lot of people like to use different sizes pieces of cardstock, and I'm actually going to do that throughout the video, but I'm going to start with some A2 size pieces just so that I have things to build on. And when you cut a 6x6, and this is actually more of a 6x6.5 because that little hole is at the top of them, and so there's about a 1/2 inch up there with the hole in the middle, and you can kind of work around it a bit. But when you cut a 6x6 piece down to an A2 size card front, which would be 4 by 5 1/4, so that you could leave a 1/4 inch border around the edges, it makes a 2-inch strip along the side. And I take advantage of this a lot. If you're not new to my channel, if you're a subscriber, I do a lot of 6x6 paper pad tutorials plus these kit tutorials. And so you can see that I'm used to using 6x6 pattern paper and kind of know what sizes I can get from it. But one thing I like to do, and I had done this with the pink paper, was I cut one piece of the cardstock into a 3x3 size, and I recommend sometimes holding off a couple pieces of cardstock to cut into some different sizes. Having some A2s ready to go is definitely helpful, but if you chop up your whole paper pad like that, then you're much more limited in your options. As I'm going through this kit and this paper pad, I don't need a lot of wedding cards. And I think that if you need a lot of wedding cards, this is definitely the kit for you, because you could make a whole slew of wedding cards and, be very pretty and all that. But I just don't have a purpose for that many wedding cards. So what I decided to do instead was focus on the thank you sentiment. Usually I try to make my cards to fit with the, I like to donate cards to Cards for Hospitalized Kids and to some other organizations. And actually, if you are interested in card donations, there is a link in the video description to a page on my website that shares lots of information about donating cards. However, looking at the sentiments in the set, it was like celebrate, congratulations, thank you. I could make some birthday cards, and I have purpose for birthday cards. However, they don't accept those as donations. So at the organization that I donate for. So I didn't want to make those, but I did want to make some thank you cards because I'd used up a few recently. So I'm going to make a lot of thank you cards and then a congratulations and a celebrate here and there. But most of these cards won't be donated and go into my personal stash. But no worries, because very soon I'll be working on another Doodlebug pad and have a bunch more cards for donating. So anyway, back to what I'm doing here, since this is supposed to be a tutorial. I am stamping with the Distress Oxide inks onto those 3x3 squares. And I'm going to do 2 with the Distress Oxide Worn Lipstick and 2 with the Barely Beige Simon Says Stamp ink. And when I do these kit videos and when I work with a kit, I try to use mostly the kit contents without adding a lot of extra stuff, just because I think it'll appeal to a few more people. You don't have to have a bunch of extra dies to make it work. Kind of to me, the point of a kit is that it all works together, and you can do a lot of stuff with just your kit ingredients. Obviously, you're going to have to add stamp blocks and black ink and things like that, but I just wanted to see what I could get with just the kit. And so I'm going to again use my MISTI, partly because I'm going to stamp multiples. I'm going to stamp 4 of these, and so it just kind of saves me some time. But this is a really, really big stamp, and I don't even know if I have a stamp block big enough for it. So to me, using the MISTI is pretty convenient because obviously it's large enough. And also, I am finding with the Barely Beige, the first time I stamp down, I'm not getting a great impression. And I don't know if that's because it's a really light color or if I'm not holding the stamp to the page long enough, etc., etc. But I wanted to be able to stamp it more than once. So here on the left, the big flower image is stamped in Barely Beige, and on the right, it's stamped in Worn Lipstick Distress Oxide. I love that Distress Oxide ink not only does wonderful, amazing, beautiful blended backgrounds, but it also is a great stamping ink that has that really bright pigment color, yet dries. Because I've tried other pigment inks and they don't dry. You know, this is not just a pigment ink. It's a hybrid blended whatever ink. I know hybrid's not the word for it, but it has some pigment and some dye. So it actually dries, which is awesome. So here what I'm doing is I'm stamping this main sentiment in black so that it really pops. And then I'm going to accent it by re-stamping the sentiment in one of the colors from the kit. So here, because I stamped with the Barely Beige, I am going to do the extra sentiment stamping in the Worn lipstick. Then on the other one, I stamped the main sentiment in black, and since the flowers are in Worn lipstick, I'm going to stamp the extra sentiments in Barely Beige. Now, at the end of the day, like at the end of looking at them or whatever, the end of using them, I don't know, words. Sorry guys. I actually like the way that the Barely Beige looks kind of stamped around it, whereas like with the Worn lipstick, if that was the extra sentiments, it actually kind of popped more because the Worn lipstick is such a bright color compared to the Barely Beige, but I think it's cute anyway. Here I'm going to assemble some cards with these 3x3 squares, and I'm going to just make 2 for now, but I go back later and use the other 2 squares. So again, I am kind of just working on pieces of a card at a time, but soon I'll do a little bit more start to finish cards. But, you know, again, I'm just looking to share some ideas with you rather than to for you to make the same exact card, although of course you're welcome to. So here I'm using these little extra bits that I have, these little strips of paper that I got from cutting my 6x6 pads down to A2 size cards, but I don't want to waste paper. And so what I'm doing is once I cut the banner edge in, I'm seeing how big do I want this little banner to be, and then trimming it off there and tucking it under that stamped panel so that I have a little bit more of the pattern paper left over to create another banner or something else with. Throughout the video, you'll see that I use the ATG gun. I find that it's pretty economical and easy to use, so that's what I'm mostly using as adhesive. There's a lot of good options out there, and when you're working on some smaller pieces, it might be helpful to have something like Multimedia Matte from Ranger as well, but I find that most things I can just tape down. I want to talk a little bit more about the patterns. Since I'm not doing wedding cards, I am finding it a little bit more tricky to use some of the patterns. I'm not doing love cards or anniversary cards or anything like that. So I'm trying to stick to some of the more generic patterns. Here, I want to have the banners go across the Celebrate panel, across that 3x3 panel. However, the little piece of pattern paper that I'm working with is not long enough. So what I'm doing is just sort of cutting it in the back and then taping it down behind it so that it looks like one long continuous piece, but it's not. And I'm going to do the same thing here with this pink. I don't want to use up that whole little strip of pink because I could use it somewhere else on the card. So I'm just going to cut 2 little banner ends and then again tuck it behind the cardstock piece or behind that pattern paper piece, the Celebrate, the sentiment panel, so that it looks continuous. And I hope that that's a helpful tip for when you are trying to make something like that work, but you don't quite have the size you want. You can always trim it up in the back. And I do that sometimes with ribbon too. If I don't quite have enough to get all the way across the card or something like that, you could put a little piece over it. And with the patterns, not only am I trying to avoid some of the lovey-dovey sort of sentiments, and there was actually 2 pieces of the pattern paper that even though I looked at both sides were very clearly wedding. And so I haven't even used those ones. But because the papers are double-sided, usually one of the sides is a lot less wedding, love, anniversary themed. So keep that in mind if you're not looking to make a bunch of wedding cards. Now I'm back to one of those Distress Oxide ink panels. And I thought that this large stamp would kind of speak for itself, similar to the way that it did on those little sentiment panels that I had just made, but I wanted to use the full large piece of it. And so I thought, well, if I stamp it in black, I'm not even going to need to color it in. I'm just going to be able to create a sort of pretty custom pattern paper in a way by stamping it. And this again is the Bristol Smooth cardstock. So even though that large piece I wanted to stamp on the Misty just because it is so large and I don't have a large stamp block like that. Some of the smaller collage pieces that I will add to it, I can actually just stamp directly on instead of putting every little thing on the Misty. And in the end, that tends to save time. So like here, I'm actually using a stamp block even though my card's still attached to the Misty. Why did I do that? I don't know. Like, because I think that made me stamp it crooked. I don't know what was going through my brain at the time, but as I continue to sort of fill in this background, I'm going to switch to stamp blocks. You know, Misties are not necessary, but, you know, they're a helpful tool. I will be stamping some of the leaves and roses, and if you wanted to get a little bit more of an intricate look, you could do some masking here, because it'll make it a little bit easier to fill in the areas. You won't have to find the exact right size stamp, but masking would also take a while because you have to stamp it and snap it and fussy cut it out in order to make it work. So in this instance, because I was making so many cards, I decided to kind of do things the faster, easier way. And this stamp set does have two small stamps that work well to fill in those areas. There's a teeny tiny flower and then a teeny tiny circle. Now you might notice at the top, I haven't really quite filled the paper and the stamping isn't great up there, but that's because I always plan to put a little strip of pattern paper at the top. Basically just to break up the panel a little bit, since I thought that covering the whole background would have been a little bit less interesting. I think, again, I basically just want to take advantage of the pattern paper since it is part of the kit, and because there are so many scraps of it that I have around my table at this point. I feel like if I don't make a point to use the scraps, I'm going to wind up with a lot more extra cardstock than I intended. I also thought it would break up some of that, the large pink panel, because there is so much pink. Breaking it up with a little bit of black and white would be a good idea. And that's the other reason I also mounted it on some black cardstock. So at this point I haven't used the Daniel Smith watercolors. A part of me was not super excited to be getting just tiny little bits of watercolor because I actually have quite a few watercolors, so I'm a little bit like, you know, this isn't really anything new. I know what watercolors are. I have watercolors. But I will say that they were really nice watercolors. I mean, they are professional watercolors as far as I understand, and they are good quality, and if you wanted to try them, it's a nice way to give them a shot. I don't see myself going out and buying a set of Daniel Smith watercolors, even though they're beautiful and nice, just because I have some. Here I'm using more of the watercolor paper, and this time I'm just creating some washes. I wanted to use the watercolor in a couple of different ways. In the there's like that little design inspiration sheet that comes with the kit, and in that there was a picture of a card where they had done like a wash in the background and then stamped the large flower over it, and I thought that was really pretty, but I didn't want to make the same card that was on the inspiration sheet because you guys have already seen that card, and I'm, you know, again, just trying to show you some different things you can do with the kit and without a lot of extra stuff. So I decided to try a wash instead, where theirs was a little bit more of a free form shape, and I wanted to get a chance to sort of look at all the colors too. I was going to watercolor one of the flowers or some of the flowers later, and I thought, well, this will give me a feel for, you know, what colors I can make by adding water or less water to these the four colors that were provided, because there's not a lot of color. And I thought, well, doing some color mixing might be nice too, but you have such a small amount of it, and I didn't really want to contaminate them. But I think that if you took a little bit of the pink and a little bit of the yellow and put on like a stamp block or something else, you might be able to get like a different color, like orange in that instance, and work around and play with it to get a couple different colors. But here I'm just using the pure pink, the pure blue, and the pure yellow, whatever their specific names are. Those are not the names, obviously. So what I'm doing to create a color wash is I am starting by wetting the paper so that the color will immediately start to move around. And then when I've just started adding my brush to the paper, it has the most ink on it, the most pigment on it, and then as I start to pull away, less and less pigment is left on it, so that kind of creates the fade, and then I go back and add even more pigment to the top just to create a fade look there. Then I trim them up, and as you could have seen, they aren't perfectly all the same size because I did not cut them out ahead of time. I just made a wash and kind of let it see what it would do. And I'm going to, again, use this giant floral stamp. So what you're probably noticing is that, like, I'm obsessed with this giant floral stamp. To me, it was the prettiest part about the kit. I tried coloring in some of those smaller roses, and I just didn't like the way they looked, and I think that's more of just like me not knowing how to color them. But a quick tip, what I did there is you saw I like stamped it off on a piece of scrap paper. That's because my stamp is kind of black and stained from using it with the VersaFine ink, but that's not actually coming off the Distress Oxide. So I always like to test that though, so before I stamped my watercolor panel, I just pulled in a piece of scrap paper to make sure that that black wasn't going to come off with my pink. I think it's because the VersaFine ink is a waterproof ink. It doesn't clean off your stamp as easily, but it also won't continue to come off your stamp either because it's not going to be activated by the wetness of the next ink. So don't worry about having stained stamps. They usually stamp better if they are stained, and if you're careful with them, you'll still be able to see the image really clearly, and actually, in fact, probably better. So I stamped with the worn lipstick over the pink. The worn lipstick is a pretty orangey pink, whereas the watercolor is a much redder pink, but I still think that they wound up looking pretty together. And the pink that is in the card kit, like in the pattern papers, I would say lends a little bit more towards the worn lipstick than it does towards the reddish pink of the watercolor. So something that might be helpful to keep in mind as you work with it. However, with the blue and the yellow, I decided to go back to the Barely Beige and stamp with that instead. And I don't entirely love the way this turned out because there's no blue in the pattern paper. So I felt like when I went to combine it with some pattern paper, and there's no yellow in the pattern paper obviously too, and so I went to combine it, I had to pick black and white panels from what I had in terms of the choices. And there are a couple black and white panels in there, so it worked out fine, but I was much more limited in what I could use. And even with the pink, because again I used that pure watercolor pink color, it actually doesn't coordinate very well with many of the pattern papers because again it's a very red pink and they are not. So I again felt that need to like be careful about how much pink I put it with. Also, here I'm cutting a banner into the bottom of that watercolor piece, and I want to let you know that was pretty scary because I was like, I don't know if I'm going to like this, and then I'd have to start all over again if I don't, or just accept it. But yeah, so even though like I think sometimes people think like, oh, we planned this all out ahead of time or whatever just because we're recording a video. I don't. And sometimes I do like things like that on video and I'm like, I wonder if I'm going to have to erase this and pretend like it didn't happen later. But a lot of times I do try to, even if I decide not to use it, leave it in just so that you can see. Sometimes you just kind of have to take a gamble because it's just paper. As much as it would take me extra time to go back, I could always recreate another watercolor panel. You know, there's more watercolor paper in my stash. I don't know about you guys, but I've massive amounts of every kind of paper out there. So I created a black border. Again, because the pattern papers weren't quite like perfect for the watercolor panels, I thought separating with a thin strip of black made it all work a little easier. And so I'm also going to stamp a black sentiment. Again, just so that it kind of works with that little black banner edge I put on it. And if you saw, what I basically did was cut the banner just a tiny bit bigger than my watercolor panel. And I did that before I glued it down so that I wouldn't have to, tear everything up. So I watercolored that giant flower and it looks super pretty. However, it took like a super long time. And I don't know that I would be coloring it again because I don't like spending like, I don't know, it must have been like an hour or hour and a half just coloring that. And that's probably because I'm like super slow. But anyway, I don't know. It's just not as much my thing. I'm not a big flower girl anyway. So I didn't really, I don't know, I don't want to color a bunch of flowers. I hate to admit it. But yeah, really pretty though. So, and that's the no line watercolor look. And I'm pairing it with the Distress ink background because again, the watercolor, so the papers don't go as well with that watercolor pink. However, I don't mind the way the Distress ink pink looks with it. It's still not quite the same kind of pink, but it matches a little bit better. And I took a little piece of pattern paper to put behind the flowers just to ground it a bit. I think that can help sometimes so they don't look like they're floating in space. I used that sort of tan color, but on the back of it was a black and white stripe, which I actually think would have been prettier, but I'd already put adhesive down when I realized that I liked it better, so I kind of just stuck with my original plan. And I'm going to use the same bit of beige, since that was a 2-inch strip that I cut down to 1 inch. I now have a whole other 1-inch strip of it. And I'm going to use that for the sentiment, and I'm actually going to trim it up a little bit. In this case, I decided to go with the congratulations, even though I don't need a lot of congratulations cards, but I thought this was interesting to share that. Basically, I kind of decided upon the sentiment based on the size of an element I wanted there. I wanted a long strip of paper there to balance out the large sentiment, or sorry, the large flower image. If I went with a really small sentiment like the thank you, I think it would have been lost and looked like it was floating around in space, and it doesn't really work as well with a banner. And I knew that I wanted a banner. I didn't want to stamp the sentiment directly on there. Again, I wanted to give it a little bit more visual weight. And so I hope that makes sense, and that's kind of a helpful tip, like a way to think about it, how you do want to keep in mind how one element in your card works with another element. So I've used 2 pieces of the 3 pieces of Distress ink background paper that I've made, and I wanted to sort of chop it up a bit in my last piece, just so that it wasn't a pure background, since I'd done that twice already. And I had figured out how to do a tiny bit of Copic no line coloring with this stamp set. The first couple things I tried to color with it were kind of frustrating because the ink is so light that once I put a layer of color down, I couldn't see any of the details anymore, and it became really difficult to color them in. However, with these couple of roses, I found a few colors of Copic ink that were dark enough that you could the ink would sort of disappear behind it, but yet light enough that I could still see the details to add them in. However, even doing that, I don't really love the way they look colored, so I would probably stamp them in black if I were going to stamp them again, instead of trying this no line coloring, just because it was so difficult for me personally. And here I'm going to use the purple flowers with the pink, and again I'm going to have to go to one of the more black and white panels, because if I add too much pink, there's nothing really to tie in the purple. So I don't want it to look like there's purple out of the middle of nowhere when everything else is pink. But if you used a pink rose, you wouldn't be able to see it against the Distress ink background. So I hope that makes sense. But I'm also trying to share a little bit about how I pick colors and patterns, since I know that, based on people's comments, that is something that they're trying to work on. And I add a little bit of a rounded corner down at the end. So I'm getting towards the end, and my original goal was to make 10 cards with this kit, and I was going to try to make 10 unique cards, but then I realized I'm really bad at that. I'm kind of getting used to making multiples, so I'm usually like, oh, if I think this is pretty, why don't I just stamp it twice? So there's a couple of repeats within here, but again, like I said, I hope that there's enough unique ideas that you guys still appreciate it. But because I was getting more limited on the pattern papers that were left, what I decided to do was to use some of those pieces of Simon Says cardstock that come with the kit. Usually I don't bother to just use those for card bases because they're really nice cardstock, And I can buy really nice white cardstock in bulk and make really cheap card bases and then save the quality colored cardstock for elements on a card rather than just to slap on a big piece of pattern paper. However, in this case, I'm actually going to leave a lot of the card base showing, and I'm going to create a really clean and simple card with one big 2-inch banner and a 3x3 square, and then you're going to see a lot of that card base. So I thought, well, that's an instance where using a really quality colored cardstock base is worth it. And that's just a personal opinion. I'm not trying to knock anybody who uses really nice colored cardstock bases all the time, because I think that they're pretty too, but just economic wise, I tend to use white a lot. And so I'm just going to tape all of this down to the front of the card and create a really clean and simple card. And these are those panels back from the beginning where I stamped 4 of them, but I'm using the other 2 in this way. And as you can see, those ones I put the flower in the top right instead of the bottom left, like the first time I used those panels. So at this point, I think I have 9 cards. And I'm like, all right, I need to squeeze out one little more card. And I had this pink rose already colored up, but it looked terrible in the distressing background just because it was like basically the same color. And I had this little piece of black scrap sitting on my desk. So I was like, well, I guess that's what I'm going to use because here it is. And that's why it's fun to work with the whole, like to keep the kit out and make a bunch of cards at one time. Because the things that were sort of scraps from one card can become elements on another card. And again, this is an instance where I chose my sentiment based off of the design of the card. And that might not be the most practical way to go about it, but I know that I'll always need another birthday card, or Celebrate's a little more ambiguous too, so I could use it for some other ones since it's just an elegant card with these floral backgrounds. And so I balance out that large flower with the leaves with the sentiment. Thank You would not have balanced it because it's a much more compact and shorter sentiment. And I'm going back to my pattern paper, and I don't have much left. I think these are like literally the 2 pieces that I have left at this point, except for the strips, but like in terms of A2 size pieces. And that writing one is very much a wedding one. It has things like, I love you, they lived happily ever after, every love story is beautiful, etc., etc. So it's not really going to work for a birthday card. And then so I went with a different pattern paper, but I really am liking the way that the letters look. And so I wind up using it anyway. And I use it instead for a strip along the card. So this might have to wind up being like a wedding or anniversary card or something like that. But again, it's so funny that you might be able to use some of this stuff for like an anniversary card, for instance, if you're trying to mix it up a bit because you don't need all those wedding cards. However, like, you're not going to probably want to give one of these to a guy. You're going to give it to a couple, I guess. Like somebody, I don't know. It's just funny. It was a challenge for me to use this kit because of the very clear theme of it. However, I think that I did an okay job pulling it off. So, I had these bits of black cardstock left, and I'd made my 10 cards. So technically I was off the hook, and I could have just been like, no, I'm done. But I saw those, and I was like, duh, Distress Oxide ink looks great on black cardstock. So I should be doing that. Like, why haven't I used that yet? So I'm going to stamp 2 panels of black cardstock with the Distress Oxide Worn Lipstick. And again, I'm going to stamp that super big flower because obviously I'm obsessed with it and don't know how to use the other stamps in the stamp set. And I remember watching a video where Tim Holtz said that in order to get the bright full color on black cardstock, you actually have to oxidize it, the Distress Oxide ink, which means get it wet. So I decided to try it by spritzing one piece and not spritzing the other and seeing how they looked to compare. And it's going to be a little hard to tell in the video, but I want to point out that yes, the one that I spritz, which is this one here, does It is a little bit brighter in the sense that the color stands out from the black a little bit more. And I think you can kind of see that in the video, but it also kind of smeared a little bit. It's not as crisp because when the ink touched it in the spray form, it kind of pushed some of the ink away from the crisp image. So it does make the color a little bit more prominent. It brings out the color a little bit more to wet it, but it also smears the stamp a touch. So kind of think about those things when you're stamping an image. So again, the one on the right is the oxidized version. It's clearly brighter, but a little bit smeared. The one on the left is not oxidized. Still looks kind of pretty, but it's definitely a little bit different a look. So that's it. There's 14 cards now, and I'm kind of like flipping through them here fast, but there'll be some more at the end, and there'll be a coordinating blog post where you can go, and I'll share some of the measurements that I use too, in case that's helpful to anyone. And here's what's left of my kit. I have the stamp set and the inks, of course, still ready to go, and I have little bits of the pattern paper, but not much left. However, I did want to say, if you were interested in the stamp set and you weren't able to purchase it, or weren't able to purchase the kit, I am going to be selling the stamp set and the Simon Says Stamp Barely Beige ink, as well as the 2 extra pieces of pattern paper that I couldn't figure out how to use, and the envelope, just for a little bonus. And I'm going to sell that for $15, including shipping in the US. So if you're interested, please email me at hello@jesscrafts.com, and $15 for shipping with, for everything, and include shipping in the US. Hopefully that's clear. Email me if you have questions. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you got a lot of interesting ideas out of it. I hope you enjoyed using your kit if you were able to purchase it. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the video description below. In the video description, you'll find a link to the blog post, some links to products, and different social media stuff as well. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel for more kit videos and 6x6 paper pad tutorials. And yeah, just thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all your support. Have an awesome day. Bye.